Welcome back, I'm Raiden from Blue Order Gaming, and this week on Raiden Reviews, I'm taking a look at Book of Demons. As always, let's get started with graphics. And this is one of the many things that Book of Demons has going for it. The art style is truly unique. It looks like everything is made out of paper. I know that I've seen this art style in just a few games from quite a few years ago, but it's definitely not something that you see often. And I think that this is actually a good enough art style that I wish that more indie developers would go in sort of this direction than that retro pixel art that so many indie devs like to go for. And on top of that, I don't think that this art style is very taxing on a machine because mine was able to run this game at a super steady 64 frames per second. I don't know exactly why it chose that number to limit at. It should be able to go up to 144 frames per second, but for some reason, the game wants to cap out at 64 frames per second. All in all, though, in the graphics department, I have nothing to give but high praises. Next, let's move on to sound, music, and voice.
Ah, fresh tree.
Meet your doom.
Bathe you in blood.
The sound effects is the first place that this game stumbles a little bit. It's not that they're bad, they're actually very, very good. The problem is I feel like I keep hearing the same ones over and over and over again as I complete the same actions, such as hitting an enemy or using a spell or something like that. I feel like I keep hearing the same sound effects over and over without any variation. And with this game being a hack and slash, you're going to hear that same enemy being hit sound effect over and over and over again. In my time playing, I've probably heard it tens of thousands of times. Although, unless you're specifically listening for it, you're usually not going to notice it. Next, let's move on to music, and this is another low point for the game. Once again, it's not because the music is bad, it's because it's just kind of this generic fantasy dungeon crawl music, and it gets overpowered by all the sound effects of you hitting enemies, you picking up gold, all of that kind of stuff just overpowers the music at every turn. Next, let's move on to a high point in the game, the voice acting, which there is actually a surprising amount of in this game. I completely went into this thinking that there was going to be just a bunch of text that I had to read, and surprisingly, pretty much everything is voice acted. And on top of that, the voice acting in this game is top notch. I'm talking almost AAA quality. There are a few lines here and there where the voice actor just kind of sounds bored or tired or something like that, but for the most part, the voice acting in this game is superb, especially with the named bosses that you run into in the game. Which, speaking of the main bosses, let's move on to the next section, story. In Book of Demons, you play as a wandering hero of the player's creation. You play as one of three classes, being either the warrior, the rogue, or the mage, and you come to a town that has a quite big problem with a series of dungeons underneath their local cathedral. And being the hero that you are, you decide that you will go down into these dungeons and defeat the three main bosses in them. The first one being the cook, then the anti-pope, and then finally at the bottom of hell, the archdemon. The developers let you get deep into this world that they call the Paperverse, or if you want, you can completely skip the story and skip past all of that and get straight to the action. Speaking of action, let's start talking about the gameplay, of which I have quite a bit to talk about. I'll start out by talking about my favorite aspect of the game, and that is the cards and the so-called deck building that the game has. You can see this play out on the bottom of the screen. I currently have 5 slots open, but you can get a maximum of 10 by talking to the sage in town and unlocking more. The game calls this deck building, but it's nothing close to traditional deck building that you would find in some other games or even traditional card games. It is much more similar to just traditional systems of activated abilities and equipment. The only thing that's special about this game is that every single card is tied to your mana pool, including the equipment, which to equip some sort of item, such as a chest piece or an amulet, you actually have to reserve part of your mana, which cannot be used when casting spells. It is only there to equip items, which means that you have to make the decision: do you want more activated abilities or do you want to attach more items? And in this game, whenever I say items, basically just think of passive abilities because they aren't standard things like add more armor or whatever. They're actual abilities, such as the armor plate that I have says whenever I get hit, there's a 50% chance that I drop a heart, which will heal me 1 health. This is by far my favorite system in the game. I love having to strategize how much mana I'm actually going to reserve with items so that I still have enough to cast spells whenever I want to, but I can also have great passive abilities that keep me alive for longer. Next, I'll talk about my second favorite system in the game, called the Flexoscope. Book of Demons is designed to be played in short bursts rather than long sessions, and the Flexoscope really aids you in that, allowing you to choose how long you kind of want to play for, and then it will create a dungeon that is about that long. And these dungeons range from very small at about 8 minutes all the way to very large dungeons at about 45 minutes long. But don't worry though, the very large dungeon actually gives you exponentially more rewards than the very small dungeon. They kind of even out time-wise for rewards, so you can't just power your way through a ton of very small dungeons and get a whole bunch more rewards than if you play just a few very large dungeons. Now let's move on to the one thing that this game does that I absolutely despise, and that is the pathing system in the game. This started out as a really cool idea that I thought could be done well, but the more that I played this game, I just kept wishing that they had went with any other system besides this pathing system. If you don't know what I'm talking about by pathing system, it should be very apparent if you've been watching the gameplay in background. The character that you play as is stuck on a predetermined path, and you can only move forward and back on that path. There are a few crossroads that you will come to where you can make a left turn or a right turn, but you are stuck on this path at all times. In my time playing, I found that there are two main problems with this pathing system, and if these two problems were changed, then this would be a much better system. Sadly, though, these problems are so deeply ingrained in the game that I don't think that these would ever be changed. And those two problems are that you actually have to dodge projectiles in this game, which is hard to do when you are on a linear path. And the other one is that the enemies are not tied to any sort of path, only you. The enemy projectile thing really only becomes a problem when you're stuck on a linear path where you cannot move to the side to dodge said projectiles. This actually happens quite often, and every time that it does, it's quite annoying. The main problem, though, that I get frustrated with every single time that I play this game is that the enemies are not tied to the same path. This leads to a myriad of problems, but I'm only going to touch on a few specific ones. The first one being how you can just get completely surrounded, and that can lead to some very cheap deaths in this game. I think I need to do a bit more explaining before you can truly grasp how infuriating this is when it happens. Basically, one of the very popular abilities that enemies like to have, especially harder to fight kind of mini boss enemies, is they like to spawn a whole bunch of minions around them. Except for sometimes they like to spawn their minions around you, meaning that you're already surrounded, which wouldn't be much of a problem if you were able to move everywhere, but you're stuck on this path. And if an enemy happens to walk on said path, then they can completely block you from moving back. which means that you're trying to fight the enemy that's on the path, and meanwhile, the other enemies are just surrounding and around you. Now, this wouldn't be such a big deal if it was just one minion that you had to fight through and then you could retreat back a little bit. But no, the developers like to throw in some challenge rooms where multiple groups of minions get spawned in at the same time, which means you can be surrounded by 6, 10, 12, or even more minions that you just can't fight through immediately. And this has led to every single one of my deaths in the game. And it definitely doesn't feel good when it doesn't feel like the deaths are earned. What's worse is that the surround you with minions to try to whittle down your health tactic is used so often in this game that you can see it in almost every single floor of the dungeon. I actually would have already completely quit Book of Demons and not even done this review if it hadn't been for obtaining a random activated ability that allows me to do an AoE attack. This randomly obtained AoE attack has actually gotten me out of quite a few situations where without it I would have very easily died. And even with it, I've run into quite a few situations where I've been surrounded by plenty of very heavily armored enemies that do not go down easily, even with my activated abilities. If only your character wasn't set on a predetermined path, this would definitely not be a problem. But your character is set on a predetermined path, so here we are. And when I get to the score, think back to this pathing system because about 80% of the influence on this score is solely because of this pathing system, which we'll actually get to the score right now. If you don't know how my scoring system goes, it's not a normal numbered scoring system. It is only 3 different categories. It's either buy it, wait for a sale, or never touch it. And Book of Demons very strongly gets a wait for a sale. And clearly it is because of that pathing system. I get it that the developers tried something new, and I truly have to applaud them for trying something that I really haven't seen done anywhere else before, but it's just something that doesn't work out in the long run. Definitely with the enemies being able to go anywhere, I think that if the enemies were stuck to the same path that you were, that this would be a much better game, or if there was no path to begin with, I think that this would also be a much better game. So for that, I have to pretty much give this a wait for a sale for everybody, even people that like dungeon crawlers and hack and slash games and sort of pseudo strategy games where you have to put those cards into effect for your different activate abilities and your mana pool and having to resource that out. Pretty much for everybody, because of how the pathing system is handled and how frustrating it can be so often, I have to give this game a wait for a sale. And even though I've been saying some pretty negative things about this game, I can't wait to see what Return to Games and Thing Trung have in store in their next game, because I do have to applaud them for trying something new. And even though it didn't work out this time around, who knows, maybe next time they'll find the next big thing. As always, I'm Raiden from Blue Gaming, and I'll see you guys in the next one.